Alrighty, so for those of us, or for those of you, I should say, that didn't join us on the last couple of days of the conference, welcome again, and thank you so much for joining us for our inaugural Obliquity Medical Humanities Collective, the Medical Humanities Across Time. As you know, we have completed the history and the presence of the medical humanities, and today is the future. So welcome to the future, everybody. As you know, our programming continues to happen simultaneously in Edmonton and London. So throughout today, you'll participate in a mix of live and virtual sessions. Our keynote today will be live in London, so it'll be streamed on the Edmonton side, and then our remaining two presentations will be live in Edmonton and streamed over to the London side. So I just wanted to start things off by paying respect to the land upon which we have the privilege to work, learn, and play. Obliquity respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Inuit. Our programming is influenced by a need to address issues such as racism, intercultural competency, trauma-informed care, and human rights early in medical training. Our sessions and initiatives, such as our medical student planner, have been used as calls to action for self-directed learning and relearning. Okay, so for our keynote this morning, we have Maryam and Amala joining us. Maryam will be delivering Medical Humanities in the Age of Medicine's Technological Reproducibility. And then afterwards will be a fireside chat between Maryam and Amala, a conversation of the future of the medical humanities from scholarship to public engagement. So starting off with Maryam's talk, this talk will draw upon critical insights and arguments from Walter Benjamin's seminal essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility, in order to better understand how medicine has transformed in the modern evidence-based era with the advent of technologies from electronic medical records to artificial reproductive technologies. Ultimately, this talk is interested in how the critical medical humanities can help us better understand what the modern medical model is, how it functions, and its political consequences. Maryam hopes that we will explore what critical theory, namely Walter Benjamin's theory of art, has to offer our understanding of medicine, reveal how objective disciplines like medicine have subjective socio-political contractions and consequences, and critically consider the present and future role of the medical humanities in an increasingly technologized, my words are failing me this morning, medical model. So to introduce both of our speakers this morning, Maryam is a senior medical student at the University of Toronto. She previously earned her BA in English Literature and MA in Critical Theory from Western University. She coordinates the monthly Cross-Pollinations Health Humanities Round Series, does research in the critical medical humanities, and hopes to be a psychiatrist. Amala is a doctoral student at Western University. Her health humanities research focuses on sleep paralysis, and she is a writer for Synapsis, a health humanities journal. In 2019, she published the book, Writing the Self in Illness, Reading the Experiential Through the Medical Memoir, with Manipal Universal Press. So I will hand it over to you guys. I'll stop sharing my screen and you can take it away.
Good morning, everyone, here in London and in Edmonton. As you heard, I'm Maryam. And today's theme, as you all know, is the future. But for this presentation, I'm going to start by going into my past by presenting you a revised and updated version of the first chapter of my master's thesis, which I initially completed here at Western in 2019 under the supervision of Joel Faflak at the Center for Theory and Criticism. In the many years since, I've completed a further 3.5 years of medical school and mostly hated it, yet still somehow genuinely fell in love with patient care, especially working with patients who experience mental illness. It's interesting going back to my work from 2019 and seeing how my past questions and ideas still resonate strongly with me today, perhaps even more so than in 2019. as well as seeing how my thinking and experiences in the intervening years now also challenge my previous insights. This chapter of my thesis largely grew out of my frustration with how a lot of humanities and social sciences critiques of medicine are levied against a caricature of some big, bad medicine without really taking the time to understand in a nuanced way what medicine really is. And so I set out with this grand, totally unrealistic plan, as all fresh grad students do, to understand what modern medicine is and how it functions, with the hope that doing so would lead me to a more robust, nuanced, even humble critique of medicine, as well as productive ways forward. In order to do so, I turn to critical theory, as I always do when I want to understand the world better, especially things in the world that we take for granted and seem to just sweep us along unconsciously. Like why pedestrians even bother to stop at a red light when the streets are empty. I didn't necessarily achieve what I set out to do, that is, give some definitive, wholly complete answer to what modern medicine is and how it functions. But I did gain some insights that have served me well over the last 3.5 years of medical training, as we medical students are simply taught everything we need to know to be good practitioners of medicine, that is, to be medical doctors, without the tools or even space and time to reflect on what the heck we were just indoctrinated into. Thankfully, my master's did give me the tools, time, and space to do this reflection before even starting my medical training. And now opportunities like this let me continue to do such necessary reflection as I contemplate my future that is looming as a practicing physician. My talk's going to proceed in 3 parts. First, what the medical humanities is, at least to me. Second, using this approach to the medical humanities to understand what modern medicine is and how it functions. Third, some case studies of the politics of both old and new medical technologies that exemplify and ground my arguments. My humble hope is to show more so than tell you why the medical humanities matter, especially with regards to medicine's increasingly technologized present and future. Like Virginia Woolf in her book/essay, A Room of One's Own, which is one of my favorites, I don't want to come to any definitive conclusions and hand you a, quote, nugget of pure truth to wrap between the pages of your notebooks and keep on your mantelpiece forever, end quote. Instead, I wanted to, again, a quote from Woolf herself, develop in your presence as fully and freely as I can, end quote, my train of thought about the medical humanities and modern medicine in the age of its technological reproducibility. So let's get into it. So it would be rather hypocritical of me to use the medical humanities to give a more nuanced, specific account of what modern medicine is if I was not similarly nuanced and specific about what I mean by the medical humanities. Just a quick brief history. The term medical humanities was first coined in the US in 1948, partly as a response to the landmark 1910 Flexner report, which exposed a lack of adequate scientific and clinical education across many American medical schools and recommended a root and branch overhaul. And also included the standardization of curriculum around the integration of basic and clinical sciences. It's important to note that humanities scholars and artists have actually always been engaged with medicine in various ways, but the emergence of medical humanities as a particular institutionalized identity with its own departments and universities, academic journals, conferences, stuff like that, was indeed new to the 20th century. And so the interdisciplinary field of medical humanities emerged as and remains a kind of broad umbrella term for research and practice that applies the arts and humanities, sometimes also social sciences, to medicine and vice versa. By the earliest 20th century, however, debates emerged around just who and what were excluded by the field's focus on medicine. Most notably, the health humanities emerged with a mission to explore human health and illness through the methods and materials of the creative arts and humanities. There's also been a notable critical turn in the medical humanities. In the introduction to the 2015 Critical Medical Humanities special issue of the Journal of BMJ's Medical Humanities, William Viney, Felicity Callard, and Angela Woods recognized an urgent need for, quote, diverse ways of doing medical humanities that are not only sensitive to imbalances of power, implicit and explicit, but include activist, skeptical, urgent, and capacious modes of making and remaking medicine, and those domains closely allied to it, and hence its ability to transform, for good and ill, the health and well-being of individuals and societies, end quote. Their call is founded upon critical theory as developed by the Frankfurt School and also feminist science and technology studies. So in terms of the Frankfurt School side, it was founded in the interwar period in Germany by a group of political activists and intellectuals who were mostly Jewish men, notably including Theodor Adorno and Walter Benjamin, who were invested in philosophy and theory as agents for social change, thus offering the medical humanities a way forward into an explicit commitment to socio-political concerns, like investigating the roots of health inequities. Meanwhile, the feminist STS scholars like Karen Barad and Donna Haraway advance a way of approaching and knowing reality that is entangled and situated in particular, often socio-political context, rather than reality simply being understood as some fixed and objective entity that is out there. So this side of things grounds the medical humanities in the fact that its work is not merely theoretical and supplementary to medicine, but actually deeply and irretrievably entangled in the vital, corporeal, and physiological commitments of biomedicine. And that's a quote again by Woods et al. From the previous article. Building upon all this, my approach to an understanding of the medical humanities as a body of knowledge that includes the myriad humanities-based methodologies and knowledges that critically encounter and entangle themselves with the body of knowledge of medicine. I understand the medical humanities and medicine itself as bodies of knowledge in the same way feminist phenomenologist Sarah Ahmed understands philosophy. She says, if we think of philosophy as a body of knowledge, and like all bodies, it is with other bodies and with them in a certain way, then we can consider the encounter between philosophy and its others in terms of bodily processes. Thinking of medicine in this way helps me to first recognize that medicine has others, from patients to the humanities. Second, it helps me understand the myriad ways in which medicine encounters these others, from consuming or expelling them to being irrevocably changed by them. What I'm really invested in is how the medical humanities may critically change the body of medicine so it may encounter its others more generously, ethically, and justly. Further, ethnographer and philosopher Anne-Marie Moll, in her seminal book, The Body Multiple, always reminds me that such bodies, including the medical humanities and medicine, are not simple wholes. Rather, they're always multiple and multiplying if one attends to the practices within which they encounter and manipulate one another. That is, practices like the practice of evidence-based medicine on the bodies of patients, or the practice of using critical theory to interrogate medicine, or the practice of medicine to define itself as a hard science in opposition to soft, subjective disciplines like the humanities. They don't just fracture, but actually multiply what constitutes the body of patients, medicine, and the medical humanities. Like the body of a patient as a set of statistically derived risk factors and a complex organ system and a human who has personal experiences of illness. To the body of medicine as a biomedical science and an epidemiological science and a social healing practice. To the body of the medical humanities as a subjective practice and a rigorous methodology in its own right, and having a particular investment in the politics of health and illness. So now that we kind of understand my viewpoint of medicine, the medical humanities and medicine as as multiple bodies of knowledge, let's get into part 2 to understand the body multiple of modern medicine. So if you're a humanities student or graduate, you've very likely read Walter Benjamin's seminal 1935 essay on the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility, or another translation being the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. A kind of nerdy thing, Benjamin scholars think that the technological reproducibility one is a better translation, so that's what I use. I think I was assigned this essay in 3, perhaps even 4 different courses throughout my undergrad and master's. Each time I reread the essay, I felt more and more of the urgency of what Benjamin was arguing. In his essay, Benjamin famously argues that the artwork's aura, the aura being that which gives an original work of art its unique, authentic quality and situates it in a particular historical, cultural, and political context, withers through its technological reproduction, and that this is not just some neutral phenomenon, but rather a critical shift in art that has political consequences. Interestingly, the essay is rife with medical metaphors. Benjamin describes the destruction of the aura as symptomatic. He describes the aura as a strange tissue, and even uses surgery at one point as an analogy to explain how cameras function. His metaphorical use of medicine seemed to invite me into a reading of medicine in the age of its technological reproducibility. Benjamin's fundamental argument is that the technological reproducibility of art destroys the artwork's aura. Using Benjamin's line of thinking as both a heuristic and allegory, I'm going to explore how the technological reproducibility of medicine destroys the patient's aura. More specifically, I'm speaking about evidence-based biomedicine, and I will argue that the technological reproducibility of this medical model destroys the patient's aura and then thereby renders medicine's primary function not to simply cure illness, but to actually prescribe politics. Now, don't worry, you don't need to have actually read Benjamin's essay to follow along with this talk. I'll make sure to walk you through the key points of his essay and how they relate to medicine. So apart from Benjamin, I also draw a lot upon Jonathan Fuller's PhD dissertation on the new medical model, Miriam Solomon's book on making medical knowledge, and Colleen Derkach's book on bounding biomedicine. I won't explicitly cite them in every single instance, but just know that their work is always there in the background. So first, here's a very, very brief summary of how medicine has evolved over the last 100+ years. Scientific medicine, also known as biomedicine, was born out of the 19th century as physicians began to be trained in basic medical sciences and finally had powerful therapies to actually cure many acute diseases, like infections with antibiotics. But biomedicine's newfound scientific basis also produced the problem of medical reductionism, wherein diseases are only understood in terms of biological mechanisms and processes at the level of molecules, cells, and organs. So in short, the biomedical model primarily uses mechanistic reasoning based upon reductionist scientific knowledge, as well as a good dose of individual clinical judgment to cure mostly acute diseases. By the late 20th century, evidence-based medicine sought to replace biomedicine's reliance upon mechanistic reasoning and clinical judgment with the new, quote, conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence, end quote. That's from the famous article by Sackett et al., which really defines evidence-based medicine. This model produces a hierarchy of evidence wherein the supposed best evidence is a systematic review of double-blinded randomized controlled trials, while supposedly the worst evidence is anecdotal. But this creates another problem wherein we struggle to resolve the fundamentally case-based nature of clinical practice with the population-based nature of the research evidence we're supposed to apply to these individuals. That is, we must treat an individual patient, but we do so based on evidence derived from hundreds, if not thousands, of patients. So evidence-based medicine hasn't entirely replaced the biomedical model. It has mostly just supplanted its previous mode of reasoning, mechanistic, with a new one, epidemiological, while still maintaining a fundamentally biomedical perspective of the body as an organ system with molecular interactions. So this is why I understand evidence-based medicine, modern medicine, as more specifically a discipline that understands and treats the diseased body through an evidence-based biomedical model. There are indeed many other medical models, including a whole cluster of models generically lumped under the banner of complementary/alternative medicine, which in and of itself serves to further define evidence-based medicine by defining what it is not. Colleen Derkach's book, Bounding Biomedicine, is excellent in this regard. And actually not just what it is not, but what it is supposedly superior to. Evidence-based biomedicine holds a particular hegemony in our society. It's the model that has the most institutional authority and legitimacy. It's supported financially by the government and is the only model under which you can access free healthcare in this country. Gets the VAT with some exceptions, like how naturopaths are covered by the BC Health Plan, but for the most part, OHIP here only gets you access to the evidence-based biomedical model. It also gets the vast majority of research funds and is deemed to be the most objective, scientific, effective kind of medicine. It's kind of taken for granted as that. I'm concerned with evidence-based biomedicine's hegemony because its fundamental logic does not adequately account for unique individual patients for two reasons. First, because the biomedical technologies reduce the whole patient into parts, and second, because the evidence-based medical technologies focus almost exclusively on statistics and populations. I'm using the word technology here in a really broad sense. I mean everything, including but not limited to stethoscopes, lab tests, microscopes, computers, MRIs, electrical medical records, automated EMR, electronic medical record order sets, data analysis tools, machine learning, the list could go on. online WebMD, where health advice is given through online technologies. The issue here is that the biomedical side of the model focuses too far into the patient, deep into the organs, tissues, cells, and even molecules, while the evidence-based side of the model focuses too far outside the patient, out into the realm of mass populations and abstract statistical analyses. Both processes, while opposite in some ways, rely upon various technologies to produce medical research whose results are supposed to be reproducible and can then be used to develop everything from risk factor categories, investigations, diagnostic categories, best practice clinical guidelines, and treatments in such a way that should be able to be applied across mass patient groups in a way that yields reproducible results. Medical education also comes into this, as medical trainees are taught to use these medical technologies like stethoscopes, ultrasounds, the statistically derived evidence, EMRs, in a highly regularized way according to the technologically reproducible results of medical research, in order to ideally achieve reproducible patient outcomes. As such, the evidence-based biomedical model is not simply technologically reproducible, but is actually designed for reproducibility in the first place. Just as, and this is a quote from Benjamin, the work of art we produced becomes the reproduction of a work designed for reproducibility, end quote. That is, the evidence-based biomedical model is designed to be technologically reproducible in research, education, and ultimately practice. This technological reproducibility of evidence-based biomedicine is hailed for its scientific rigor, but what Benjamin is going to do here is help us see how this comes at the cost of losing sight of the unique individual patient, or in Benjamin's words, the destruction of the patient's aura, and the political consequences of this. Benjamin defines the Orwick's aura as a, quote, strange tissue of space and time, the unique apparition of a distance, however near it may be, end quote. Distance and uniqueness are key features of the aura. In medicine, the patient's aura is both a literal and figurative tissue. It's the various unique tissues that form the patient's organs and body, and it's also the patient's unique experiences, circumstances, and beliefs that differentiate them from other people. Benjamin goes on to theorize the modern masses seek to overcome the aura's distance and uniqueness through the technological reproduction of art. And it is this, quote, desire of the present day masses to get closer to things, and their equally passionate concern for overcoming each thing's uniqueness by simulating it as a reproduction, end quote, that destroys the artwork's aura. The technological reproducibility of evidence-based biomedicine also destroys the patient's aura at both the literal and figurative levels. Medical technologies like a surgeon's scalpel or an MRI scanner's magnetic waves penetrate the patient's literal tissues. Meanwhile, medical technologies like the statistically derived best practice guidelines or pre-formulated note structures and treatment orders in an EMR overcome the patient's uniqueness by assimilating them into generic diagnostic and therapeutic categories. In seeking to get closer to the patient, this medical model ends up actually assimilating patients into reproducible categories that are based upon what the supposed best evidence deems to be the best practices for a statistically derived average patient. As such, evidence-based biomedicine ends up perceiving statistically reproducible average patients rather than unique individuals, and its technological reproducibility destroys the patient's aura, in Benjamin's words. Benjamin goes on to theorize how a new mode of perception has developed through new technologies like the film camera, which open up what he calls an optical unconscious. Similarly, medical technology opens up what I want to call the pathological unconscious. Benjamin describes how the film camera brings to light entirely new structures of matter, and this is quite literally true of biomedicine, as medical technologies like MRIs, for example, bring to light previously unconscious structures in the human body, like the structure of neural networks in the brain. This is also true of the evidence-based side of the model, as technologies of statistical analysis and randomized controlled trials bring to light previously unconscious correlations and causal relationships that can only be perceived when one looks for statistically significant relations across mass patient populations. Yet what is perhaps most important is what still remains unconscious to the evidence-based biomedical models technologies: Chronic illnesses like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome are notorious for rarely presenting any kind of organic pathology or definitive biomarker that can be perceived by my biomedical technologies. At the same time, chronic illnesses are actually not well studied by evidence-based medicine because patients with chronic illness often suffer from multiple diseases, and these patients are often excluded from studies. Moreover, chronic illnesses are not offered much relief from biomedicine, but interpersonal care offered through alternative medical models have been shown to sometimes help. However, health interventions dependent on interpersonal care are rarely accounted for by evidence-based medicine because they're just too difficult to investigate through randomized control trials. Thus, in these ways and more, chronic illness still remains unconscious to the evidence-based biomedical model. And this is not simply a medical problem, it's actually a political one, as chronic illnesses are especially exacerbated across lines of inequity, like women, and especially racialized women's chronic pain not being taken seriously, not being investigated adequately, and not being managed effectively. Ultimately, Benjamin is arguing that the technological reproducibility of art revolutionizes the social function of art from ritual to politics. That is, the quote, whole social function of art is revolutionized. Instead of being founded on ritual, it is based on a different practice, politics, end quote. For Benjamin, art's function used to be primarily ritualistic insofar as art, by virtue of being a unique, authentic work, typically held a very particular authority within a particular tradition, like its role in religious or royal contexts, and was only accessible to select groups of people affiliated with such traditions. Now, he argues, modern art's social function is primarily political insofar as its technological reproducibility results in mass engagement with art, which transforms it into a potential tool to disseminate ideologies to the masses. Here, he's really talking about fascism and how the Nazis used film technology to disseminate anti-Semitic propaganda at the time of Benjamin's writing. It's not all bad, however, as art's technological reproducibility also has the potential to be co-opted by progressive politics. So he's not just saying that technological reproducibility is always bad. It's kind of a neutral thing until it's co-opted by a particular ideology or institution. One can say medicine also used to be ritualistic insofar as it gained its authority from a unique individual healer, like a shaman, whose healing practice was situated within a particular, often religious tradition. With technological reproducibility, modern medicine, like modern art, now bears a fundamentally political function, but fails to recognize this under the guise of its supposed objectivity. So this is why Benjamin is important here, because he gets us to really see what's going on. Modern medicine's technological reproducibility renders its social function from ritual to politics, as technological reproducibility gives modern medicine the capacity and authority to establish standards of care based upon mass patient populations for the masses, both healthy and ill. These supposedly objective evidence-based standards can be neutral in theory, but become political as they are often unconsciously influenced by political ideologies like sexism, racism, ableism, and so forth, that ultimately reify normative standards for who and what counts as a healthy, normal, able body. Masses of patients then regulate themselves or are regulated in order to meet medicine's standards. And this is often done through technologies, thus further contributing to this kind of endless loop of modern medicine's technological reproducibility. How many times can I say medicine's technological reproducibility? I don't know. So I'm going to give a couple examples to hopefully make this a bit more clear. Let's start with a historical one with a very basic technology, at least to us today. Modern pregnancy testing. So in an article, really great article in Women's History Review, scholar Jessie Olzinko-Grin argues that when pregnancy testing technology first became widely accessible and easy to use in 1940s Britain, the National Health Service strategically used and strategically did not use the technology in ways that were politically motivated, such as to actually control abortion, women's roles as mothers, heterosexual relationships, monogamy, capitalist economies, and more. So for example, married women in heterosexual relationships were not offered pregnancy testing because it was assumed that they should be trying to get pregnant. And so testing these supposedly healthy women would actually be a waste of resources under the newly funded, yet already financially overstressed National Health Service. So in this case, the biomedical model reproduces a politically constructed healthy subject. one that is deemed to be not only physically healthy, but also socially healthy by meeting societal expectations around gender and sexuality, especially with regards to motherhood. Now, something a bit more contemporary, let's think about risk factors and how they're produced and mobilized. Risk factors are in some ways exhibit A of what we get from the epidemiological foundation of evidence-based medicine. With the technologies of mass data collection analysis, we're able to identify so many risk factors for various diseases, from postpartum psychosis to diabetes. We can understand risk factors as those things that have been found through evidence-based studies of mass patient populations to increase the chance that an individual will develop X illness in their lifetime in such a way that can ideally be applied to and reproduced in individual patients. In this way, evidence-based medicine's technological reproducibility, we could say, categorizes and transforms individual patients into part of a mass that is always already at threat of developing X illness. This becomes, has a political function when we interrogate how these supposedly objective risk factors like race, BMI, gender, diet, obscure how there are further risks that are things like racism, fat phobia, sexism, or food access, and how those kind of systems uniquely intersect for individual patients. So this issue actually becomes even more exacerbated with the kind of looming threat of machine learning in medicine, which again takes mass patient data, analyzes in such a way that is hopefully reproducible and applied to individual patients. And yet lots of work has been done to interrogate how these data sets often exclude, for example, racialized folks, and thus end up reifying certain politics like racism in the way that they're applied, but that these kind of issues are obscured by the supposed objectivity of this evidence-based biomedical model. One thing that's also, I think, interesting to think about is how technological reproducibility is being used by non-experts to challenge the authority of evidence-based biomedicine and produce a very different kind of politics. So this gets back to what I was saying, how technological reproducibility isn't all bad, it can be used in very different ways. Take TikTok, for example. I think exhibit A of the technological reproducibility of art, and something that probably has Benjamin rolling in his grave right now. Many TikTok users are now using information and experiences of their own illness through the app to self-diagnose various medical conditions or to encourage themselves or others to go and seek various diagnoses. I think the most notable example are mental health disorders like ADHD and autism. So DSM criteria and symptoms for these conditions are being not only virally reproduced and made accessible for the masses, but also challenged and added upon, with new symptoms or quirks of these disorders being added constantly and disseminated through TikTok. Much of this is actually politically motivated by, for example, feminist and anti-racist interventions where women and people of color are retroactively self-diagnosing or seeking diagnoses of ADHD and autism, as these diagnoses were previously often missed in anyone who wasn't a white boy by the medical establishment. So these kind of TikToks are also part of a larger politics of neurodiversity and disability that seek to destabilize what has traditionally been deemed to be a normal, sane mind by evidence-based biomedicine. So just to wrap up, in summary, I think what's really important with Benjamin or critical theory in general is how it kind of unmasks and brings to light things that are going on in the background of a supposedly objective, taken for granted model like evidence-based biomedicine. It helps us understand the political underpinnings and functions of this. And I think that can help us better understand what the medical humanities do and how it can hopefully help change the body of medicine. So that's it for my talk. Thank you. I think I'm going to invite Amala up to do our conversation, and then perhaps we can do questions at the very end of it all. Does that sound good over on the Edmonton end? So I invited Amala because, one, I think her work is super amazing. And 1 second, I'm just gonna grab something. And also intentionally, because I think it's really easy to get caught up in like the silo of medicine, and it's important that if we're going to do medical humanities work, to make sure we're doing it with humanities scholars like Amala, who is a PhD student in the English department. And I mean, that's where like my roots also are. So I'm going to start with a question for Amala. Can you give us a brief overview of how you got into the medical humanities and what you've done in the field thus far?
Sure. I'll just start by
Maybe, yeah.
The cozy fireside chat is promised. So I'll just want to start by saying that this is really a super exciting opportunity, and I've been at Western for 4 years now, and this is one of my first kind of direct collaborative moments with Schulich. So that in itself is really exciting, and the fact that it's occasioned by Maryam, who happens to be a student of Joel Fafak, who's my supervisor, is also really phenomenal. I followed your work since your master's thesis came out, because I've just found it fascinating, the kind of critical interventions that you've made. And based off of that, I think I'll just, maybe start by saying that my own introduction to medical humanities was in 2015, 2016, with a course that I took under Dr. Gayatri Prabhu in the Master of Arts program in Philosophy and English at the Manipal Center for Academy and Higher Education. So Dr. Prabhu also in many ways not a typical literary scholar. She was one of the first people to begin advocacy for the need for a medical humanities-based work in Indian universities. And out of that course emerged my master's thesis, which argued for the importance of narrative in expanding models of understanding and what it means to have chronic diseases, especially when we talk about diseases that are psychologically based, that continue for a long time with significant distress. So out of that master's thesis then emerged my book on life writing, and it's been referred to already, so I won't go there in much detail. But the more advocacy-based piece, which I think I'm more interested in thinking about as one of the things that medical humanities needs to actively and critically be involved with, is what does it mean to have a medical humanities program at a university or a medical school, and what does that mean for the community that the school is based out of. So for me, that meant setting up student support center in Manipal, which was the first of its kind in India, because our medical health records are not typically delinked from academic records in universities in India. So this was the first of its kind, psychotherapy in a safe setting. So it was separated from the university hospital and set apart so that people in acute distress would not have to navigate the registrations, the kind of long maze of a hospital where it's teeming with extremely high numbers of people, all kinds of barriers to access, and just the fact that it simply exacerbates distress, right? From the master's, then after these kind of more public facing things, I moved on to my PhD, which is, as you know, at Western, and I'm exploring sleep paralysis in my work. So as in connection to your talk, Maryam, I think my work tries to examine what evidence means for something that is chronically a condition and which may not necessarily require a cure in the way that an acute disease does. So I examine sleep paralysis because it is, as all of you probably know, one of those conditions that occurs perhaps in an isolated way, possibly with narcolepsy, and also chronically for several people, separate from narcolepsy. So the fact that there's an entire cultural apparatus of beliefs and evidence that have nothing to do with the DSM, that have perhaps nothing to do with how REM sleep influences sleep paralysis, to me, that's fascinating. And it's important to acknowledge that body of work and see how literature and visual culture have something to add not just in a supplementary model, but in a critical, creative, a refashioning of how we understand sleep paralysis today.
Yeah, that's so great. Do you want to also maybe touch on the work you do with Synapses?
Yes, of course. Yeah, that's a big piece of what it means to be a public thinker to me, because Synapses, as you may know, is one of the earlier medical health humanities journals, which was founded in Columbia University and aspires continually to be a department without walls. So it's one of those models where I have seen truly collaborative work happening, because you are at the same table as humanists, as literary critics, as artists, philosophers, anthropologists, scientists, and medical practitioners, all sharing possibilities for what it means to be involved with the health humanities, and by extension, of course, the medical humanities, refashioning writing. So I've been with Synapses since 2018 now, and I have cut down my active writing time a bit till I finish the dissertation. But that is just because you realize when you're writing a dissertation that a lot of the work needs to be set aside just for the writing work needs to be just for the dissertation. But I hope to actively return to it in a bi-monthly fashion once this is completed.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to give a quick plug. If you want to hear more about Amala's work on sleep paralysis, she's giving a talk with a poet who also explores sleep at the last Wednesday of April. It's virtual. Just Google Cross-Pollinations, League of Canadian Poets. And I think that'll be another really great health, medical humanities conversation. So I guess you kind of already started to touch on this, but a question for both of us is, what do you think are some of the challenges the medical humanities faces in both academia and the community, education, all these sorts of things?
Yeah, so many places to go with that for sure. I guess for me, medical humanities and its intersections with the work that's happening in the humanities needs to happen in a significantly more collaborative manner. I think there's a lot of alongside work that's currently happening. So it's humanities work alongside medical work and so on. And the places where it's interdisciplinary is often in the methodology of the work, but how do we actively invite voices from the humanities into the work that is happening in medicine and vice versa? And to me, that could look in a variety of ways. It could be the setting up of medical humanities centers across universities. Some of it's already happening, of course, with Scope at U of T, for instance. And perhaps the other piece of that would be to move backwards beyond the current medical cohort in each year and towards undergraduate medical education, undergraduate education for people intending to enter medicine. And in that, again, there are multiple pieces, I think, because as we know, there's an increasing focus on making medicine accessible and equitable and inclusive. But where exactly does that happen, right? So for instance, something like a world evaluation service is being required for an international undergraduate degree for someone who's applying to medicine is a symptom of what I think is the kind of problem that persists in inequitable access, because a student who may have significantly advanced since that first degree would still be weighted by an organization that is not the medical school, and that evaluation by VES is the final word. So I think that the idea of access and equity, accessibility, social justice, which are the principles of what medical humanities work aims to take up, needs to happen more urgently, and not just at the level of medical curriculum that all of you, of course, are experiencing and actively modifying in very promising ways, but even earlier. So at the undergraduate level, how do we make the process actually accessible? And it definitely is happening in the ways in which there are pathways for students to apply to medicine, but we need to ask the question, are these students people who have had access to Canadian undergraduate education, or are they students who are, coming from other backgrounds and thereby experiencing unequitable access? And how can we modify those issues from medical humanities and take those up actively? So a more socioculturally aware medical humanities in Canada, I think, is an urgent kind of piece for me. How about you?
I agree with all of that so much. And I think, like, taking on to what you're saying at the end, I think part of the issue is also how dominated medical and health humanities is by like the British North America situation, or like you can call it more the global North. And I'm only just like tapping into like how much work in the medical humanities is coming out of India, for example. And like part of the access issue is like most of the conferences are like literally in North America, for example, and like who can get visas to come here. And then another point, also touching on what you were saying earlier about like really being collaborative and interdisciplinary. I think like a first step that people have been saying for so many years and like is still not happening in terms of medical education is like actually bringing humanities scholars and their experts into medical schools, like at U of T, which purports to be like a school that has supposedly a strong humanities base. I have never, ever had actual humanities experts leading any of this kind of curriculum. Instead, I get like literally a general surgeon who has no background leading a small seminar where everyone had to like make a little work of art and do like a little show and tell about it. And then it's funny because I've actually seen them publish studies on this, like making it seem like it's this whole humanities intervention, but in real life it's not. And then they publish the studies only with other medicine people as well. So you just see how this becomes like this reproduced cycle that like the knowledge bearers are still the people with MDs. And then the other experts that I think the medical humanities is also guilty of neglecting in the same way medicine is like patient experts. And I think in the humanities, and this is happening in medicine too, the shift is starting with scholars who are patients themselves or who have illness, being actually disclosing that, which comes with its risk because like academia is still super ableist, but that's kind of a place where patient perspectives are coming in as well. And we're seeing that happen in medicine as well, of like the patient turned doctor or the doctor turned patient. But I think we can also just be okay with bringing patients in who aren't necessarily in academia. So yeah, those are what I think are some of the biggest challenges that we're facing. Another question, what do you think should be I guess we kind of already touched on this, about like what should be the priorities of the medical humanities going forward?
For sure. Yeah, I think what you said about this kind of co-opting of the humanities methods, I think this is really tricky territory, right? Because the goal of the medical humanities is to have expertise sharing on both ends and kind of meet at this middle fusion of horizons, possibly. But realistically, what does happen is, extremely accomplished MDs who have a narrative medicine training, possibly a humanities course somewhere, taking on that work instead of the underfunded humanities scholars who have studied these particular principles and theories of medical humanities and are working to fashion social justice perspectives, being left as an aside. So for me, it's deeply troubling that the Scope lab hasn't had any folks coming over who are actively humanities scholars based out of humanities to talk to medical students, right? So like grand rounds having medical humanities people integrated there. So those are, I think, urgent ways in which it can actually happen in an immediate fashion. Then of course it would always be, I think, at the level of pedagogy and curriculum to have humanities training and humanities trained professionals integrated into the curriculum. And realistically, of course, I say this with the awareness that medical education is already in its current state often overwhelming for the medical student, right? So how do we do this in a way that doesn't add to the current burnout and the challenges faced by medical students, not to put the burden on them to say, add this extra elective and become this more humanistic physician, but to make it a less risky endeavor, to have it less as an elective and more as something that rewards you as part of the curriculum that you're already doing, right? And I think you and I could keep talking about this for a long time, but I think that the medical humanities in Canada do have a long way to go, and that there are promising centers and thinkers such as yourselves, of course, and we need the silos to have better ways of speaking to each other and bringing people to the same table and having active collaborations in any school with a medical program to have conversations with its humanities faculties and make that bridge really accessible at the undergraduate level for students who are planning to apply to medicine, so that they don't have to wait till they get there and they don't have to take those risky humanities courses that nobody wants when the GPA requirement is a 4.0, right, to apply. And then how can you take that risk, which leaves interested students at a disadvantage again? So yeah, it shouldn't. I think it's always a problem if this happens at the personal individual level and the particular applicant or medical student has to carve out their own pathway to a medical humanities learning and reflection practice. And it does not happen in a way where it's rewarded. I say all of this with a deep appreciation for the work that is happening in making medical schools more equitable, more accessible, the curriculum more humanities focused, but I do think we need more stakeholders from the humanities in this process.
That was such a amazing reflection. I feel like I just want to end there. And like, so yeah, humble about everything going on from both sides. Not that we want there to be sides, but and really affirmed what my experiences have been as well. Like I had all these grand visions of all this humanities stuff medical schools should add in before I went to medical school. And now I'm just like, leave me alone. It's so overwhelming to just get through like the bare minimum you need to practice medicine. So I struggle with that. The only other thing I'll add quickly about something, a priority going forward, is I think like having a bigger priority in medical humanities scholarship that adds not just to medical education, but to like medical research and the evidence base, which is why I love the work you're doing with sleep paralysis. Because I think a lot of the medical health humanities grew out of these interventions in medical education and health professions education. And I think we're only just at the tip of the iceberg of what humanities methodology, evidence, rigor offers the evidence base. Because as I said, like it is chronic illnesses all over. And I think that's like a huge place where medical humanities can really support our understanding of medicine, of patient experiences, of just like the actual knowledge base of these conditions. So I'll wrap it up there and open it to questions.
I want to pick up on what you both said about bringing people together. I've been at so many conferences where the humanities scholars talk about the challenges of them integrating into medicine, and they're not recognized by their own disciplines anymore because they seem to be doing that and won't be stuck with medicine. And so they end up having two parallel career paths because they have to do stuff that medicine.
Yeah, I'll just quickly repeat the question, just in case Edmonton didn't hear, but it's a question about how a lot of the times scholar or doctors or just people in the medicine world have to lead this like dual track career because what they're doing in the humanities isn't recognized for what they need to do in the medicine. And then also how when they do want to collaborate with humanities, they're kind of met with suspicion sometimes. And so like, how do we get this kind of collaboration? And I think that's like actually goes back to what I was saying was like a big interest of my thesis to start with, because I was like, I feel like from the humanities, we just paint medicine and like psychiatry, which is something I'm interested in, is just like point blank, like bad. And like very, very suspicious of it. So I just want to say that like that very much resonates. And I do think though, like Amala's perspective, I mean, it sounds so like cliche to say, but it seems to be like a generational issue as well. Like, I think that the humanities, the medical humanities scholars who are coming up have a much more nuanced take on medicine, especially I think part of it is because of people's patient experiences that are kind of making people realize, be like, okay, there's like parts of like medicine that I need, you know, just to like be well in the world. And then there's also like parts that I have issues with. And so that often brings people to these like other perspectives on medicine. So I don't know. I guess I have hope that it's like more of a generational perhaps change. But the thing about like how you need to kind of do both things as well, I'm like, is that just going to be a generational thing? Like, I don't know. Like, do my humanities publications carry any weight when I'm doing my residency application? Like, I actually don't know. And that's like perhaps a risk I'm taking. So yeah, that's kind of a flawed answer. Do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I'm hoping that when you apply for a psychiatry residency, they would count at least a bit more than they would for, say, a surgical residency.
Yeah.
And I agree with you so completely. I think that there's a huge problem at play if the welcoming scholars who want to engage with critical medical humanities are the ones who get the brunt of all the challenges that exist. I think for me, it would be perhaps at the level of training. So if, say, a humanities scholar wants to study perhaps a more nebulous health condition, maybe supports around accessing, a neuroscience lab and enabling those things could be actively pieces that could help bridge those divides and make those connections more meaningful so that there's validity then in some ways on both ends. Yes, you may still appear to have left the methods of the humanities, but it would come from a place of having investigated other methods actively and not because you didn't have access to the lab that you needed, and therefore you just stuck to a humanities-based research model. So perhaps just at the level of a graduate education for me, it would be, say, if you came into a first-year program and you wanted to do a medical humanities project, it would be, what are the research pieces that are missing for you to actively engage with both the medicine and the humanities side of this, and not just make the project humanities based only because you didn't know how to do that work, So the know-how piece, I think, is a place where scholars who want to support these dual career folks could really step in and enable access, because of the way in which the university is still quite siloed. And that's, as we know, not just a medical humanities challenge, it's a university problem generally. So yeah, I think that would be a good place for me to take it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to repeat that question quickly. Thank you so much. The question is, there was a recent article in Higher Education about post-pandemic and having students more involved in like co-designing curriculum in medicine. And what might that look like? Do you want to go first? Or?
Sure. Yeah. I guess for me would be, so if, out of an event such as this, if there were reflections that would emerge, how do we perhaps take that on board the next time there's a curriculum review, and just imagine what it would be like to have more events such as this, but do it in a way that, always is cognizant of the current demands on the medical students. So that would be one piece. And co-designing, again, co-designing curriculum would, again, for me, always mean having humanities-based researchers who are also studying medicine, such as you are involved in such design, so that we have both the experience-based piece, which is the experience of having engaged in events that are medical humanities-based or narrative medicine, and also from a theoretical critical standpoint, having a place to recognize the research work and the previous experience that someone has brought in, and best supplemented, of course, by those physicians in the making and medical students, residents who are open about their own experiences with illness, and bringing that into the fold with a kind of awareness of the risks it takes to share those narratives in the public space. And all of those, like those three prongs would be important in co-design, I think. Yeah, I'll pass that to you because I think you'd have ideas on this.
Yeah, so my undergrad here at Western at the School for Advanced Studies in Arts and Humanities was actually very much like all about students being involved in their own education. And so a big way that took shape was one, like feedback being genuinely given and immediately implemented. Not like sometimes even halfway through a course being like, this isn't working, like let's change this. Whereas I find in medicine, there isn't that flexibility, and it's like you don't see the change for like 2-3 years later. And so the people who ask for the change don't experience it. And that leads to like a disenchantment with wanting to bother to like be involved. And then another big thing, and I think we need to like look to the US for this. In Canada, we don't really have electives as medical students, especially in the first 2 years or first 1.5 year. And like clearly there is a way you can have electives, because the States has it. Like you could take an elective on poetry and medicine. You could take an elective on some kind of social determinants thing. And I don't know practically how this works, but I'm like, it's possible. And I've actually shifted away personally from being like the humanities, the medical humanities needs to be done for everybody, but instead making space for the people who are interested or curious to get to have further training in that. I guess because I'm actually like quite optimistic about what like new cohorts of medical students are like they actually are very diverse. Like my classmates are actually really invested in like advocacy and different perspectives on health and different kinds of things. And I see like people in the audience nodding, but then I feel like we're not given the time to like go down our niche pathways and what we each uniquely have to offer. So somehow bringing in electives. Another just like practical thing for like co-curricular development, which is not going to happen, but this is just like my grand vision. There needs to be like an economic overhaul of how teachers are compensated, because at least at U of T, for example, not even the MD lecturers or like seminar leaders are paid. I guess like there's some way in which they're paid by being like adjunct faculty or associate professors, but they're all like, I gave up half a day of clinic. I gave up a day of OR, where they would have made like way more money. And so there's that financial disincentive. And then on top of that, like when humanities people or students are brought in, it's like unpaid labor. Like I am someone who cares a lot about like disability activism and justice medical education, but I actually refuse to be part of the student disability like curricular development, because I was like, you are spending so much money on like this curriculum and you can't even like pay me to help you design it. And like that's really radical to be like, you should pay students in the same way you pay like the consultants you hire and stuff. But I think that's like actually the justice perspective. So it's like paying the MDs who are already teaching all the way to paying the students, to paying the humanities scholars like that we bring in. So those are just like some practical things that I know will probably never happen. I'm just going to quickly see what is in the chat.
I'm hopeful from the kind of work that is happening here that someday it might, Maryam, because you're absolutely right that fiscal piece is so important to asking people to represent a perspective or be on a curriculum design piece. For instance, I designed a comprehensive exam for health humanities at Western, and it came out of a need to want to read those texts, right?
Yeah.
But I think for, say, a medical curriculum piece, it would be even if you wanted to design just an elective and you proposed that, you don't have a guarantee that it would get taken up because you're not in charge of your own education in the same way as you would be in grad school. And then the other piece is you're not, again, getting compensated for it at all. So it's your time in an already very pressed schedule. So
Yeah.
it definitely needs to happen from a call to recognizing where the need is and where voices are gathering to put together knowledge mobilization pieces and recognize what's missing in the curriculum. So yeah, I think it needs to be paid work.
I'll also just quickly add for the Toronto audience in the chat. That's so interesting. U of A does have electives in the first 2 years. So
That's amazing.
So does Dal. Okay, so like what is going on? At U of T, we have the most hours of anatomy of any medical school in the country, and they keep telling us that that's essential. And I'm like, you could literally cut 6 hours of it out to give people an elective that has 6 1-hour seminars. Like, not all of us want to be surgeons. Anyways, that's a rant for another day, and I see people nodding. Yeah. Yeah, so it was like a comment and question about how medical schools can be so caught up in like teaching minutia and still having to like memorize all this content when like we can all look it up on up to date. Like everybody just has up to date in their pocket. And so one of the big like what does the humanities offer is like how to think. And so I guess for me that is like the biggest thing that the humanities brought for me. And I'm so happy I had that perspective before I went into medical school, because I really think it helped me. So an example is actually like from the get-go of third year, which is clerkship, where you're doing stuff in clinical environments. My supervisors were like astounded at how fast I was at writing notes, even in psychiatry. And that was because in the humanities, like you have to learn to consume an enormous amount of information that is not given to you in any like clear way. Like, you know, have you ever tried reading a philosopher, critical theorist? Like it is a disaster. And so I really became good at being able to hone in on what is the key information and then to put that back together in like a clear way for myself and other people to understand. And so when I go and see patients and they're telling me a story in like the most zigzag tangential way, and then I also have to combine that with information from the lab, like their lab results, and information from Connecting Ontario on their past medical, like this whole conglomerate of information, I could very quickly hone in on what was important and synthesize it and present it to someone else. And so that was like actually the biggest place in which I see my humanities background come into play. And I think a lot of people in medicine, especially practicing physicians, would agree that learning how to like manage that and write notes efficiently is like so much more important than memorizing like, I don't even know, like memorizing exactly how nephrons work, because like that's what will help you survive in this, like having huge caseloads. So that's just one example of where what you're saying really resonates to me, that if we had more of those opportunities, and that's like something that really needs to be honed. Like, it's not like you can just teach someone how to take a bunch of different information and put it all together in a clear and concise way. You have to actually like do it over and over again. That's why, you know, people have to train so hard to do the critical analysis and reasoning section of the MCAT, because if you haven't had practice of reading stuff in that way and thinking in that way, it becomes really hard. Whereas I didn't have to study for that section because I had already had that training for so many years. And I think that's actually an evidence-based proof. Sorry, I'll wrap up in 1 second, because I think it's been shown that like the critical analysis and reasoning section of the MCAT, that score is like the most highly correlated to like doing well in medicine. So that's kind of, yeah, the information gathering and transforming that information into something that is like clear for yourself and others, especially when working in a team environment.
Yeah, this is a truly fascinating discussion. I think that, yeah, as we know, with ChatGPT-2, now we're back to the drawing board in some senses of how much can we do with, you know, this constantly evolving technology that is for some a terrifying prospect, and for others it's a welcome one, it's an exciting one. So, and I think what's inimitable perhaps in the methods of the humanities is what Maryam's gesturing to, this ability to think critically that actually must be taught. It doesn't come naturally. I don't think it's something that happens if you just pick up a book and read it. It can, and it perhaps could, but it isn't a natural jump from reading to critical thinking. And so that's where, there can be an argument for this kind of negative capability, as John Keats puts it, right? So we're not reaching after facts or reason, but we're trying to remain with the uncertainties and mysteries and doubts that come from what it means to actually interact with patients who are, say, in palliative care. There's no cure, and we know that there's a crisis with aging in Canada, and what it means then to bring in different principles of reflection and critical thinking in those engagements. Maybe that is not something that it can be done in a traditional, 100 people in a classroom model. It needs to happen always, I'd say. I don't think it can be prescribed as a mandatory course, but for those who are interested, if we are able to advocate and, garner support for critical thinking as a necessary tool that can be taught by the humanities. And I'm always careful when I say tool, because we don't want an instrumental view of the humanities, right? We don't want it to be just a set of tools to supplement something. But I think when done well, it's exactly the opposite. It's a way of thinking and being and expanding medical knowledge that isn't instrumentalized, that allows for you to explore those parts of your experience as residents, as physicians, in what cannot be contained in medical curriculum traditionally, and must look to the humanities then.
Yeah, I love that bit about like the uncertainties and that's kind of what I love about Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own. Like, well, I read that when I was 18, I think, the first time, and she's just straight up says, like, I'm not going to offer you a conclusion here. I'm just going to kind of meander, and you're going to meander with me and like figure what you will. And I think getting into medicine requires you to be like on this very specific path and to not meander. And then we get into actual clinical environments, and we're like, oh my God, like even for myself, like I'm not gonna lie, I cannot stand uncertainty. I think I can tolerate it in some ways better because of my humanities background.
Exactly.
But yeah, it really hits you how much everything is just like, you have to be okay with the meandering. And thank you to Dr. Bette McLean, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, for reassuring me about my psychiatry and other applications. Yeah. So the question we had here, also, if anybody like wants to go take their break right now, just please go ahead. Will not be offended. But yeah, the question was about this kind of merging of and tension between evidence-based medicine and then this kind of more perhaps narrative or other approaches that come from understandings that come from the humanities, and how we bring those together, especially with regards to patients and who may not be quote unquote good patients or make good decisions or what we think should be done. Do you want to start? Or
sure.
Just sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, sure. I think for me, like, I could just use sleep paralysis as an instance, I suppose. So if somebody presents with, say, recurring instances of sleep paralysis, what would their experience or their reading, their experiences with visual culture help with the presentation, the diagnosis, right? It would be, well, it's called sleep paralysis, but then we had to, if you knew then about the existence of the phenomenon called nightmare for centuries, right? And the fact that I think of this instance that will help solidify what I'm saying. When I told my colleague and friend about the fact that I was working on sleep paralysis, her mother, who was on the phone with her, said, no, it's not sleep paralysis. It's the demon on the chest. The demon on the chest. It's not sleep paralysis. They're wrong. It's like, yeah, I agree with you absolutely. It's just one piece of the big puzzle, right? So if someone insists that they saw something in their room and that the feeling that it was real was more pressing than all the other affects, which is the anxiety, the insomnia, the persistent fear of sleep for the next few days, the fact that that insistence on the real, if you have some exposure to that experience-based model of understanding that that supplements your plan for the patient, right? Then, because it cannot just be the fact that it's convincing and it's helpful to know that it won't put you in any danger if you have sleep paralysis. It's not fatal. That's helpful for sure, but is that enough? Maybe not. Maybe acknowledging that it does feel real, even if it is induced by a break in your REM sleep. That itself, I think, could make a radical difference to the trust in expressing those parts of the experience that may make a patient feel like, will I get a diagnosis of a psychiatric condition if I really say what happened, right? And it comes from the stigma with certain conditions where it's not so clear how much they indicate or have comorbidities with certain psychiatric conditions. It's not clear how much it may just be a totally incidental fact that you have sleep paralysis. So I think that establishment of trust would happen if there was this kind of broader eclipse of what the condition can mean from an affective and broader standpoint beyond the explanation, which in this current era, I'm sure anyone who's coming in with sleep paralysis probably looked up what it is and the fact that it occurs at between sleeping and waking and all of those prescriptive pieces that can be found within a 2-minute search, right? So it's the other parts that they need help with, the fact that it's a spiritual reckoning, it's terrifying, it makes you question the supernatural, all these other philosophical pieces that cannot fit within, in good ways, perhaps, within the biomedical classification.
Yeah. I'll give another example, like for mental health with bipolar disorder. But first, I think the thing that helps with your question from the humanities side is actually almost like we often talk about humanities and empathy training, but I actually find the most helpful is almost like an anti-empathy, which is just being okay, like realizing that you can't know someone else's experiences or like ideas, and just being like, that's not a prerequisite to care. Like, I don't have to get it. And being okay with that and respecting the other as other in this like very radical way. And so sometimes we get hung up on like, I don't get why this patient won't like be active. Like, look at their hemoglobin A1C and their like diabetes. Like, I don't get why they won't do this. And that like kind of just like puts you against a brick wall instead of being like, I don't get it and that's okay. And then that invites a kind of curiosity to like hear someone else's perspective. And so with bipolar disorder, as an example, the medical model of it is that it is a disease. It is a very serious disease. It is a biological disease, highly biological, like schizophrenia. And mania and hypomania are pathological and bad, and we need to put people on medication specifically to prevent it, as well as preventing the depression. But if you read about or you hear about patient experiences of bipolar, you will hear over and over again, and I will say this as someone with bipolar disorder, that when you know what really good feels like, you don't want to give that up. Mm-hmm. And so people are like, why don't you take your meds? Like, look what happens to you when you don't take your medication. You're like a bad patient in these ways. But I think if we attend to this other side, like if we look at it not from just within this evidence-based biomedical model, then we can start to kind of work with patients towards like, what are their goals? So for me, my goal is like, I don't want to be hospitalized. And my other goal is I don't want depression, but I actually don't want to never experience hypomania again. And that's like really like, can really be a crazy thing to say to a psychiatrist. And instead I turn to psychotherapy to manage those episodes with so that I can learn to manage them myself in such a way that I don't have like terrible consequences as a result of these episodes. But that I can still like experience that kind of euphoria. That is like a fundamental part of my identity and experience in life that I like. And that's not captured by the evidence-based biomedical model. That's captured by reading people like Kay Redfield Jamison's work on her experiences with bipolar disorder. So that's an example I think of where this kind of like good or bad patient that is determined to an evidence-based biomedical model needs to be like rethought. And part of that is like the humility of the humanities to be like, I don't totally get it, but like, let's work with what your goals are. And also to just be able to like read about these different experiences that might like really challenge what you think about a certain illness or disease. But thank you so much for everyone, both here and in Edmonton, for engaging with us and the amazing questions.
Thank you so much, folks.